Man, is it noon yet?
Not yet.
God. Come on. Oh my God. Oh man. Man, this intermittent fasting sucks. Oh my God.
You know, let's listen to Jennifer Troupe from Missoula, Montana on all the latest dietary trends.
Man, it's so good.
So good.
So good.
Hey everybody, hope you're having a great conference. I'm Jennifer Troupe and I am dialed in from Montana, Western Montana to be exact. I'm a registered dietitian and a diabetes educator, and I have worked in the field of diabetes for about 20 years, seeing patients, working with physicians, managing groups, and kind of working with different technology and devices. So I'm very excited to be part of this amazing group and conference. So today, I am excited to speak on a very exciting topic and a controversial topic, which I think has a lot of interest right now in the diabetes community and the type 1 community, and that is low-carb diets. Ketogenic diets, intermittent fasting diets, and are they fads or are they fabulous? And hopefully by the end of the next 20 to 30 minutes, we'll be able to answer that question and talk about that. So I look forward to getting started on that. And at first, let's just go over kind of some of the points we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the current guidelines for diabetes management, specifically from the American Diabetes Association. We're going to talk about some of your treatment goals for type 1 diabetes, just to set that premise as we evaluate whether these are for you, and kind of also go over the history and the change and how we got to where we are today with this movement towards low carb and intermittent fasting. And then we're going to come up with our answer. Are they fabulous or are they fads? And just some closing thoughts. So without further ado, let's get started with the ADA Nutrition Consensus Statement that was just completed in 2019. And about every 4 to 5 years, a group of nutrition experts in the field of diabetes come together, look at thousands of research articles, and try to help us really understand what's the best way as a clinician to direct our patients. And so this group of people I respect and some I know personally does this, and I just so appreciate their advice and guidance because I do think it's very pertinent. And it's been interesting some of their takes this time and what they're getting from the research. With that, before we look at all of these different diets and evaluate them, we want to also look at what are some of the guidance out there so we can have that as to set the stage for evaluating these, because we really do always need to go back to the research and what does the evidence say, and not just one person but 1,000 people, right? So certainly the evidence is very clear, and I don't think this is a shock to anybody that we want to minimize our intake of refined carbohydrates and added sugars and instead focus on carbohydrates from vegetables, legumes like beans, fruits, dairy, of course, which is milk and yogurt, and whole grains. We also want to look at the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, which includes fruit juice, as well as processed food products that have high amounts of refined grains and added sugars. And we want to really strongly discourage the use of those products. We also want to look at the quality of carbohydrate foods selected. We want those to ideally be very rich in dietary fiber. There's a lot of benefits to fiber besides just the ability to flush things through our intestinal tract. Very much there's benefits with our heart as well, and other areas. We want vitamins and minerals to be a part of that. Carbohydrate food, and we want it to be low in sugars, fats, and sodium, right? Kind of like that whole grain bread versus the croissant. The type of fat consumed is more important than the total amount of fat, which it used to be really total amount of fat and total amount of carb for that matter. And so there's a lot more, I'd say more of a focus on the type of food, the type of macro that we're having, and that is kind of a switch, even though we've always encouraged. There's really much more of an emphasis now on where is your food source coming from, and how much of an impact does that have? And I think that there will be a lot of research on that in the future. So the type of fat consumed is more important than the total amount when looking at your metabolic goals and cardiovascular disease risk. And it is recommended that the percentage of total calories from saturated fats should be limited. So saturated fats are those hard animal fats typically that have been shown to raise your LDL cholesterol, right? And the LDL is the bad cholesterol. We don't want a lot of that. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I appreciate this. I've practiced that with my patients over the years. As we all know, we are individual. We have individual preferences for foods. We have individual just lives and schedules, and so we really need to make sure that we are fitting the plan to the patient versus trying to make the patient conform. And this bolded statement, I think, is very important, and it really goes over that, you know, we need to reduce the overall carbohydrate intake because that has demonstrated the most evidence for improving glycemia, which is your glucose control. And this can be applied in a variety of eating patterns that meet your individual needs and preferences. So that's a very profound statement. And I've never really seen them, I think, come out with that profound of a statement before from this arena. Further, if you look at these recommendations and macronutrients, right? So those are our large food groups. Vitamins and minerals are our micronutrients. And so macronutrients, carbohydrate, right, which is your breads and your grains and your starchy vegetables. Your proteins is another group. That's our meat, fish. And then our fats, which are oils and the fat, you know, we visibly see on our food, and avocado, for example, is also a fat. So those are our three main macros. And actually, I'm seeing a lot of discussion about macros these days. And so there's this requirement that we have 130 grams per day intake of carbohydrate to meet our brain's requirement. And that comes from the Institute of Medicine. And that is definitely a valid and important research statement that we know our central nervous system, brain and spine, needs carbohydrate for fuel. Now, however, you know, there are other metabolic processes that can fulfill this requirement. And this has kind of come about, I think, with some of the keto information, frankly, and it's been out there, but it's never really been pulled as forefront. I certainly, in past years, have very much stressed the importance of the 130 grams. And there are certain disease states, and like when you're pregnant and different times, that you need that intake from oral sources or food sources. So we'll get into that further. And then don't forget the fiber piece too, and fiber is found in carbohydrate. You need 14 grams per 1,000 calories. And if so, a lot of Americans will have 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day. So if you think of 2,000 calories, that's 28 grams, right, per 2,000 calories. So really, the more fiber, the better, but you better drink water if you're increasing your fiber. Fat, the recommendation is that should be about 20 to 35% of our total calories. And certainly the trans fats, those synthetic man-made ones that have been on the food shelves for years, that really the food industry has jumped on board and tried to get rid of. We still certainly want those reduced. But certainly the sources that come from animal sources or, you know, natural plant sources, well, that's fine. That's a whole different ballgame. And then protein, really they say it's undetermined. So it's very much looking at your individual needs in regards to how much protein you should have. So very much very vague compared to other years. And then I think this statement here, just that we want to individualize carbohydrate, fat, and protein percentages to normal eating patterns while meeting calorie goals. So, you know, really looking at how do you eat normally and making sure we try to match that as closely as possible, but while incorporating those guidelines and what your goals are with your diabetes. And so that kind of takes me to the next slide, which is going over the standards of care that were published in 2020. In January this year, which are published every year about what are the recommendations and guidelines for good diabetes control and management. And so, you know, I think we need to just look at that when, again, we're looking at these diets and how would they fit with these goals. So, of course, we want an A1C under 7 while minimizing hypoglycemia. We know with type 1 diabetes, hypoglycemia is a big factor, and we want to make sure we're lowering blood sugar safely and not increasing those events that can be life-threatening. Blood pressure, we want it under 140/90. LDL cholesterol, we want under 100. You see, I have asterisks next to all of those because they all can be individualized depending on what your treatment goals are with your doctor. You may need lower goals, or you may need a little bit of a looser goal depending on what your goals are, what's going on with your health, and all those factors. So again, that's individualizing your care. Triglycerides should be under 150, and your HDL cholesterol for men should be over 40, and for women over 50. Remember, the HDL is that good, happy cholesterol that we want as high as possible, because it's really kind of more of a heart protector. And then we also want to achieve and maintain your body weight goals, and of course, delay or prevent the complications of diabetes. And just a reminder that the strongest predictor of diabetes complications is glycemic control. So, right, the control of your blood sugars, the decrease, especially in that variability, up and down, and those excursions in your blood sugars, the less your chance of those complications. So something we need to keep in mind as well as we look at what is going to be the best eating pattern for you. With that, we need to go back in history just a little bit and kind of look at the bigger picture of what's going on with obesity in our country, because that is a driver of some of this change. You can see here, this is a slide on the left that is showing the increases in obesity in the United States. In adults, in 1960 through 1970, we were somewhat flat, and then we've just really started climbing since the 1970s. And there are some theories on that I'll share with you in the next slide. But nonetheless, we do really have an epidemic going on. We're in a pandemic right now. I think that we should probably give the obesity epidemic, frankly, just about the same amount of concern that we're giving COVID right now, because this is taking a lot of lives and impacting a significant amount of people and their quality of life. So definitely something we want to pay close attention to and keep in mind as well. On the right, the New England Journal of Medicine, published in December of 2019, and the New England Journal is kind of the prestigious journal, that really I think most physicians will go to and say, oh yeah, they say it in the journal, it's valid. As we dissect research as we do in this profession. But anyway, if we look at the state level prevalence of adult obesity and severe obesity, so a reminder, obesity is a body mass index of over 30, and severe obesity is over 40. It's also called resistant obesity, and typically these folks are prime candidates for bariatric surgery, because this is really becoming a disease state that we're having a difficult time fighting. And you can see their prediction is by 2030, 1 in 2 adults will have obesity and 1 in 4 will have severe obesity. So that's staggering. And definitely something needs to be done about that. So when we look here at kind of, well, how did we get to where we are today? And that graph I showed you, there in a lot of the literature, they talk about the diet heart hypothesis, which Ansel Keys, a physician in Minnesota, had hypothesized that fat is the #1 contributor, dietary fat, I should say, to heart disease. And so he, in his research, he proved his hypothesis that the higher the fat and cholesterol in the diet, the higher the cholesterol in our bloodstream and our vessels, and the higher our risk of cardiovascular disease. So the recommendation was we'll get rid of the fat in the diet, get it as low as possible within guidelines, and we should decrease our rates of heart disease, stroke, those types of things. And that was in the 1950s when that research came out, and there were changes that happened in the food industry, that high fructose corn syrup was introduced, and all of a sudden this processing really happened, where we processed our food and took the fat out and replaced it with more carbohydrate, and that theory that this is driving the obesity epidemic. And then it kind of leads into my slide on the right, which is kind of like insulin carbohydrate hypothesis, which I know this does state type 2 diabetes, and this is a type 1 audience, but I think it's important that you see the background and know how it could have an impact on you. the hypothesis then is, well, if we reduce the carbohydrate intake, we're going to reduce our circulating insulin levels, which will reduce liver fat and help us lose weight. And certainly will reduce fat in our other organs, such as pancreas. And then we're going to reduce that insulin resistance. That's in type 2 diabetes, but we know folks with type 1 can have it too as they get older and as they get heavier. And then, of course, you know, we're going to reduce basically that piece with the insulin secretion. You're going to secrete less insulin if you have less of a, eat less carbohydrate, but also really helping to provide the increase in insulin secretion if you've had a reduction, right? With type 2, that happens. And certainly we know with type 1 diabetes, right, you don't have any insulin being produced. And that this will reverse type 2 diabetes. So if we decrease carbs, we're going to decrease our circulating insulin, and basically we're going to have a reset with our metabolic profiles, and our insulin resistance is going to improve, and our insulin levels are going to be where they should be to keep our blood sugars in a normal range. That was the hypothesis with that, and that's driving some of this. So I called it a tale of two theories. So let's get to, you know, these diets and really kind of dig into what's going on with those and what they are. We know, again, it's controversial. Within dietitians, within providers, within the research, within books, within the media. I mean, everywhere you go, this is a hot topic. So we always want to go to the research and see what does it say. And so if we look here at low carb diets, let's start with that. The recommendation is, and the guidance that I could find, that's kind of the standard definition, is that it's less than 130 grams of carbohydrate per day, or the carbohydrate is 26% of your total energy intake. And per the American Diabetes Association, most people, adults with diabetes, are taking in about 45% of their calories from carbohydrate. So this is a significant reduction just in what is the average norm. Now that is type 2 and type 1. My suspicion would be folks with type 1 diabetes, that their carb intake is probably a little less, or your carb intake is probably less, but I know we all vary with that as well. We want to emphasize vegetables that are low in carbohydrate, have fat from animal food. So we're going to increase that a little bit. Butter, avocado, oils. And I should say these are the guidelines. I'm not going to say that I want to increase your butter intake, but that's what the definition and the research is showing these low carb diets contain. I will also say there's a variety of plans of carbohydrate diets, low carb diets, and different methods and different foods to include in the fat category, the carb category, etc. And on the left, you can see one of the examples of a plan. So protein in the form of meat, poultry, fish, shellfish, eggs, cheese, nuts, and seeds. Some plants include fruit, not all. And typically the berries, for example, may be included because they're higher in fiber. So it's really only a really high fiber fruit that would be included. And of course, they want you to avoid starchy and sugary foods such as pasta, rice, potatoes, bread, and sweets. And there are quite a few low carb diet and meal plans out there. Some of the more recent and famous are the Zone and South Beach. And of course, Atkins, specifically the original Atkins. He is kind of gone towards lower carb recently, but anyway, that is kind of an example of some of those diets out there. And I just wanted to pause for a minute. I do love history, and I love the story of the discovery of insulin. And I just thought in looking at this, it was interesting to me, somewhat the direction that some of us are heading. And that if we look back to, prior to the discovery of insulin, right, folks with type 1 diabetes, were on starvation diets, and, they were limited to less than 10 grams of carbohydrate per day, and really were on water fasts until the glucose in their urine, or glycosuria, was resolved. And that was really the only option available, right? And if you lived, a couple of years, you were lucky. And certainly once insulin was discovered in 1921 and really kind of on the market in 1922, that we died. And this picture here, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, just kind of brings to light again, once we had insulin, we were able to actually be nourished. But I think when you look at, there was fasting and there was carb reductions, and those were the diets I'm talking about today. It's just kind of goes to the, sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same a little bit. So when we look at low carb diets, let's look at the pros and the cons. So in clinical studies, if you look first at the pros with the low carb diets, and I just kind of labeled those LCD, and that's kind of how they're labeled in a lot of the literature. They did see reductions in some studies in the hemoglobin A1C, as well as blood pressure, weight, triglycerides, and they saw an increase in the HDL cholesterol, which that's what we want. And there were some studies that just showed a prevention of an increase in hemoglobin A1C versus maybe there wasn't a reduction, but still a prevention and an increase can also be a win. It may reduce post-meal glucose excursions, was also something that was a pro, and it would be. There was a reduction in total daily insulin dose, and that makes sense, right? If we eat less carb and we're using an insulin to carb ratio, we're going to have a reduction in the amount of insulin we take. I think this was interesting. There was a reduced error rate in determining insulin doses. So therefore the glucose fluctuations were reduced because there was just less carb to count. It was less complicated. There's also a reduction in hypoglycemic episodes, lower all-cause mortality with the increased fat intake, reduced hunger, and increased satiety or fullness. And then in type 2s, there was a reduction in the hyperinsulinemia, which we know that the high insulin levels in type 2 can cause excessive weight gain, the metabolic syndrome, inflammation, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and cancer. I think it is something to note, and I think there's been a lot of studies and workshops on too, looking, however, at protein and fat content, and those of you on insulin pumps, and of course you're taking your rapid acting insulin, and that impact as well and that's a factor as well, which they really didn't talk about in any of the research I read, which was interesting because we know that has an impact as well on your glucose levels, but certainly not as strong as carbs. We know that. A con or negative, some studies did indicate a 12 to 20% increase in mortality with the increased cardiovascular disease, cancer, and all-cause mortality when you increase the fat in the diet and lower the carb. And there was a study where half of those who attempted a low-carb diet stopped at 2 years. Longevity is not strong in a lot of these, I would say. There was, in a type 1 study, short-term improvement in the variability, right, the up and down, the glycemic variability in your blood sugars. But again, really, they said, we need more evidence and studies. There was a study that showed the more fat in the diet, the more your desire for sweetness increased. There are mixed studies on satiety or fullness. So there wasn't a real strong conclusion, even though one study did show that. There's others that showed, we don't know if that really affects whether you're hungry or not. And then there was a very strong study, I think it was in JAMA, it was the Medical Association journal, that compared a low-fat diet versus a low-carb diet over the course of a year, and really said there was no difference in weight loss. One of the things I would say, however, when I look at a lot of these studies, though, is if you remember, 26% of the calories, right, was a low carb diet, right, of your total calories. Some of these use 30, 35, or 40% is a low carb diet. So that is a piece that, there needs to be some standardization in the research of what is a low carb diet, because right now it's all over the board. The sustainability was difficult long-term, and the studies in support of a low carb diet really lacked that consistency, as I just mentioned, in the definition, length of study, and follow-up. And low carb diets are not recommended for a variety of reasons: for pregnant or lactating women, for folks who have kidney function that's impaired, if you have an eating disorder or at risk of one, and if you're taking SGLT2 like Invokana, Farxiga, or Jardiance. Now, I know most folks out there with type 1 do not take these. However, I do know some doctors are prescribing them, and so I just thought I would call that out. Or if you have a friend with type 2, you want to make sure they're not taking these. And that's because there's a risk of diabetic ketoacidosis with that. So let's move on to the ketogenic diet, which is really another form of a low carb diet, but this is just a very low carb diet. You can see on the left here what kind of eat on a keto diet. And this is, again, one example. Just like the low carb diets, there's many examples of a keto diet. So less than 20 to 50 grams per day of carbohydrate is a definition of keto. Less than 10% of your total energy from, or calories from carb is a keto. So those are kind of your two standards. It's very similar to a low carb pattern, but just further limits the carbohydrate containing foods, and meals typically derive more than half of their calories from fat, right? There's just a lot of fat in the keto diet. You burn stored fat for energy, right? So how does this work metabolically that we think it could help with weight loss? And your metabolic parameters is that after a few days of reducing carbs, the production of your energy relies on fat stores. Because once you've depleted your carbohydrate stores, you really have to turn to an alternate fuel for metabolism. And that would be those fatty acids that are oxidated and turn into ketone bodies, okay? And so that's, if you remember, the ketone bodies are actually what's gonna meet that carb requirement for your brain. And it's called nutritional ketosis, which is different than ketoacidosis. However, there are some similarities and I think some dangers as well, especially when we have type 1 diabetes. So we want to look at that closely. And again, as I mentioned, those ketone bodies do represent a source of energy alternative to glucose. And, you know, folks on this diet, they test for ketones. Well, of course, those of you with type 1, of course, you're already doing that with your keto sticks. And there is a company out there looking to make a breath acetone sensor, right? Because it's that, you know, that acetone that's given off from those ketone bodies that is, you know, going to be kind of eliminated, and it'd be helpful to have that. So it'll be interesting to see if this hits the market and how that works. These diets really were originally introduced to help children with epilepsy, you know, refractory epilepsy, which is where it's resistant to drugs, and kind of this is a last resort, and it was very effective. It still is very effective, and it is used. So if we look at the pros and cons of the keto diet, in studies, A1C, weight, and blood pressure were reduced. In some studies, I should say, not all. And the HDL was increased and triglycerides were lowered. So again, these are goals, right? If you go back to those first few slides, these are definitely goals we have in diabetes management. There's a positive effect with the keto, kind of the lower in carb we went, on hormonal regulation of appetite. If you've heard of ghrelin and leptin, these are hormones that really are very intricately involved in, you know, whether I feel hungry or full. And typically when we lose weight and restrict our diet, we get to a point where our body produces more of these hormones, and they are there. And this goes back to the caveman days of, they say, well, we're low and we've decreased what we're eating, we're dropping weight, we need to increase it to survive, right? And that's kind of with our overabundance of food, it's creating a big issue for us. So basically this is affecting those hormones in a positive way to help you still stay full and lose weight as you continue to lose weight, which we have not seen that in some other diets. So we see there was a decrease in emotional eating. Vascular inflammation was reduced, which is important. You know, diabetes is an inflammatory state. And if we can reduce inflammation, there are a lot of other also disease states that cause inflammation, and that's damaging, certainly in many areas of your body. It improves the left ventricular function in heart failure. We saw some folks improve sleep. Now there's one study here, and this is Virta Health, and it's an online kind of support commercial program where 12% of the weight that was lost was sustained after 2 years. Now these folks received a lot of support, though. It wasn't them doing it on their own, and I always like to clarify that. We saw medication use was reduced, both blood pressure meds as well as insulin. And again, of course, that makes sense. We would reduce insulin if we're eating less carb. We also know as we lose weight, right, our blood pressure should go down. And that's one of the things in a lot of these studies. So we see weight loss. Well, is it the weight loss that's causing this improvement, or is it really the actual mix of macros? There are positive changes in the gut microbiome, and that's this area of research that's really cutting edge and fascinating, of these different bacteria in our gut that may be positive for health and some may be negative. So they saw some of the ones that we want to see more of. we saw more of those becoming produced basically on a keto diet. So insulin sensitivity was improved. And then in type 2s, there was a significant improvement in glycemic control. So again, a lot of this, I really tried to focus on what is out there for type 1 research, but I had to pull a few of the type 2s in too. So some of the cons, well, constipation and nausea, right? If you're cutting back on the fiber and the carb, this is going to happen. And bad breath, right? That acetone, that's not a great part of this diet. And the keto flu, which happens when you have an increase in the ketone bodies in your bloodstream. You have dizziness, fatigue, and of course, again, constipation. Fiber intake may be reduced, which again, that goes to the constipation piece, and dehydration. There's a diuretic effect with these, so you have to be very careful, right? Dehydration, when you have diabetes, specifically type 1, is not a good thing. Increased risk of hypoglycemia with these. Increase in LDL cholesterol. Even though we saw improvements in some of the other markers, LDL went up. It makes sense. The more fat, especially animal fat, the higher your LDL will go. There's no evidence. There was a study actually where they looked at, does this prevent or delay type 1 diabetes by going on a keto diet? There was no evidence of that. Anaerobic exercise, weightlifting, those start and stop, basketball playing exercises, we saw where it was negatively affected. You do not have as much energy for those types of exercises. Insulin sensitivity was decreased, even though it says it was increased in one study, and another one said it was decreased. We see in children specifically growth is an issue, bone loss was an issue, and just fatigue, of course, and really there was a higher cardiovascular risk profile. A high dropout rate on this diet, as you can imagine, it is very extreme, and it's just not sustainable long term. And there really isn't any credible evidence of long-term success. So we just know that we need higher quality long-term studies, I would say, to really bring this to the mainstream. And just, I think you mentioned, or I mentioned, the microbiome and those alterations due to a high-fat diet. And so this is just a picture, and I think it's fascinating what's going on with this research. But the good guys, which is the bifidobacteria, which prevent infection and digest fiber, for example, those are decreased with a high-fat diet. And then the firmicutes, which are the bad guys, increase the calories absorbed. So what they're saying is basically, when you eat food, you're even going to absorb more, which means you're going to take in more calories and gain more weight with a high-fat diet based on the microbiome. So lots of different factors with this. I just thought I would share, this is that kind of bullet coffee or keto coffee. I've seen it advertised, and it's where folks are adding lots of cream and MCT oil in their coffee. And I really, as a dietitian, just have a hard time with this. But the theory is that in research that basically this MCT oil, which we have used like with our folks on the inpatient side, because there are certainly some benefits to these medium chain triglycerides in clinical research and with patients in certain conditions, that basically they generate more ketone bodies, so you're going to have more weight loss with that. And then it also can liberalize the diet a little bit if you do use the MCT oil, because carb and protein intake can be increased if you're using these because there's more ketone bodies. So just kind of threw that picture out. If you've seen it, that's kind of some of the premise behind it. Okay, so the last diet we're going to look at is intermittent fasting. And intermittent fasting means to go without food for a period of time, right? Some plans allow all calories and carbs on a limited basis, and some do not allow carbs. There's, again, a wide variety out there of intermittent fasting plans. And it's really a way of eating that focuses more on when you eat versus what you eat. There's a variety of approaches. I mean, from an 18 to 20 hour per day fast to alternate day fasting, to some actually you have these restrictions for up to 8 consecutive days or longer. Overall, it's another way to reduce calories, basically, and weight loss is the primary goal. And some of these plans do induce ketosis. And certainly, fasting's been around a long time. It's been a spiritual practice, such as with Ramadan. And anyway, just kind of want to call that all out. So here's a picture of the 12, 16, or 18-hour fast, and you can see really, for example, the 16-hour is one that's pretty popular. Between noon and 8 p.m. you can eat, and then you take a break, right, until the next day. So that's just kind of where all of that is. It's interesting. I personally don't think I could do that. I don't, once I'm restricted to a certain period of eating, I'm going to want to eat in the period where I'm not restricted. And that, I think, is human nature in a way, right? And that's one of my issues with diets, frankly. So some of the pros to intermittent fasting in the research, it can reduce inflammation, which we've discussed, kind of some of the damage with that. Blood pressure and cholesterol. We've seen improvements in the microbiome, those gut bacteria. Immune system function has been improved, insulin sensitivity, improved fasting and post-meal glucose levels are improved. We see some weight loss and maintenance. We see some cardiovascular event prevention. We see improvements in sleep cycles or your circadian rhythms. There's been some studies in shift workers, which we see high risks of chronic disease and shift work, that these intermittent fasting diets actually have a benefit there. And there's research certainly that consumption of food earlier in the day versus later in the day is associated with lower weight and improved health. I think I just want to go to all these pros again and say, remember, if you lose weight, a lot of these things can happen, however you lose it. The cons, more hypoglycemia, protein malnutrition, vitamin and mineral supplementation is needed. That's an added expense. And we all know that if we can find it in our food first, it's always better than taking a supplement. Dehydration, of course, because water intake from food is reduced in addition to fluids. So we really have to be careful of that. Dizziness and nausea and insomnia, falls, migraine headaches, weakness, and excessive hunger pains. I could see the excessive hunger pains, right? I mean, I'm not eating for a long period of time. I'm going to be hungry. So even though we saw improvement in sleep cycle, there was insomnia in another study. Risky for those with chronic disease. A lot of us have a chronic disease. Not recommended for pregnant or lactating women, children, adults of advanced age, and those who are frail, those with immunodeficiencies. So those that have had a organ transplant certainly should not go on something like this. If you've had an eating disorder, if you have dementia, traumatic brain injury, post-concussive syndrome. So those are all kind of some of those areas it's not recommended. There's limited long-term human studies and really insufficient data to recommend this at this point in time to those with diabetes is really, I think, was definitely a summary in some of the literature. So kind of in tying this up, are these diets fabulous or are they fads? Well, I think if I go back to where I started, which was the ADA Nutrition Consensus Statement, really they note until the evidence surrounding comparative benefits of different eating patterns in specific individuals strengthens, healthcare providers should focus on the key factors that are common among the patterns, which is emphasize non-starchy vegetables, minimize added sugars and refined grains, choose whole foods over highly processed foods to the extent possible. And I highly, highly agree and know that this research is backed. And so we want to go this way. So fad or fab? Honestly, just like this little girl here, I'm not sure. And I was hoping to give you some kind of an earth-shaking answer, but I think there's some good points and negative points. I would say with what I read, the low-carb eating plan is the best way to go if you're going to try one of those. With type 1 diabetes specifically, the ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting are just too dangerous, in my opinion, from what I read. And so, but the low-carb, and I think a lot of you are doing that, maybe you want to reduce it a little more, but I wouldn't go below that 26% of your total energy intake, or about that 130 grams, right? So that is my professional opinion. And I think if we look here a little bit more from what the ADA says, there is evidence that suggests that a very low carb eating pattern may have potential benefits for adults with type 1. But again, clinical trials of sufficient size and duration are needed to confirm prior findings. Okay, so more research is needed, right? There's an adequate research in the type 1 community to support one eating pattern over another at this time. Intermittent fasting was included in the ADA nutrition consensus, believe it or not, but there's caution regarding using it in type 1 diabetes. In that same consensus statement that I've been referring to throughout the presentation, the ketogenic diet was not included at all. And so I think that says something, that they definitely are not even wanting to look at that at this time. And of course, check in with your doctor, your diabetes educator, your dietitian, your provider, whoever that is, before starting any of these. You really want to check in with them, because there are going to be medication adjustments. There are going to be things you want to look out for, and we want you to be safe. On the left here, of course, is the Mediterranean diet pyramid. I think of all of these plans, and this was not included here because the research is already very solid with the Mediterranean diet. And certainly this is probably, of all of those, this is the way I would recommend you go. Again, and you can kind of alter that carbohydrate profile a little bit. Don't forget about exercise. You know, eating is one piece, it's 50% of the puzzle. Movement, physical activity is the other 50%. You gotta have them both together to be healthy and to lose and maintain weight. So remember, that humans live on 1/4 of what they eat, and on the other 3/4 lives their doctor. So be smart, be wise, take care of yourselves. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for spending this time with me. All right, have a good one.